I used to think that the worst part of aging would be the loneliness, the cold silence of empty rooms, the long afternoons that stretch without anyone calling, the invisible weight of a phone that never rings. But I was wrong. The worst part isn't being forgotten. It's being remembered for what you're worth, not who you are. When your own blood looks at you and sees a piece of property, an inconvenience, a number on a deed, or a monthly expense they can't wait to cross out. That's the part they never warned me about. My name is Gerald McKinley. I'm 81 years old. I've spent nearly every year of my life on the same piece of land in Westbrook County, Texas. My father gave it to me in 1967, and I've treated it with more respect than most people show each other. My late wife, Vivian, used to say that this land was our family's spine. Everything we were came back to it. She died 6 years ago, and since then, the house has been too quiet. But I've kept it, cleaned it, painted the porch, patched the barn roof, even fixed the old windmill pump. Not because I had to, because it was still mine. I have one son, Roger. Grew up under my roof, ate from my hands, learned to drive in my truck, got his first job hauling hay for our neighbor. He was always ambitious, always in a rush to leave. Moved to Austin, then Houston. Started flipping houses, buying land, talking fast and loud about real estate trends, equity, cash flow. I didn't always understand what he was saying, but I clapped when he talked. He married, had 2 kids, stopped visiting. That's how it goes. I told myself he was busy, that I didn't want to be a burden. That's what we all tell ourselves, isn't it? Still, every Christmas I wrapped gifts for his girls, sent birthday checks, called on his birthday even when I knew he wouldn't pick up. I kept waiting for the day he'd call me Dad, without that edge of obligation in his voice. But it never came. Then this past spring, he called and said he wanted to help me simplify. Said the farm was too much for me. That I should take it easy, maybe consider a place where I could rest. I told him I was fine. He said I sounded confused. A month later, he showed up. First time in years. He brought papers, some sort of power of attorney arrangement. Said it was just for emergencies. Said it would make things easier in case something happened. I didn't want to sign it, but he stood in the doorway, arms folded, calm, rehearsed. It's just a formality, Dad. I remember the way he looked at me, not like a son who loved his father, but like a man surveying a deal he was almost finished closing. That look stayed with me. I signed. God help me, I signed. Not because I trusted him, but because I didn't want to start a fight. I thought it would blow over. I thought maybe he was trying to do the right thing clumsily. I thought wrong. The weeks that followed were uneventful, until one afternoon, a white van pulled into my driveway. A woman in scrubs and a clipboard stepped out, said she was here to escort me to a temporary residence. Said my son had arranged it for health reasons. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. That there was nothing wrong with me. She smiled the way people smile at barking dogs. 30 minutes later, 2 men in uniforms arrived. Private transport, not police, but they carried the same posture. Calm, firm, invasive. They told me gently that I could come peacefully or be sedated. Those were my options. I wish I could say I fought. I wish I had yelled or broken a chair or made them work for it. But I froze. I looked at my living room, at the photo of Vivian by the window, and something inside me just gave out. I let them take me. I let them drive me away. Because in that moment, I felt like a ghost in my own life. They brought me to a place called Willow Hills, private senior care, clean walls, gentle music, locked doors. I was admitted, like a patient. But I wasn't sick. I was lucid. I was alone. They took my phone, My wallet? They said I'd get them back once the transition was complete. I didn't know what that meant. They gave me pills, food without flavor, plastic utensils, smiling staff who spoke to me like I was 4 years old. Every time I asked to leave, they told me I wasn't cleared for discharge, that my son was managing my affairs now, that he'd be in touch. He wasn't. Weeks passed, then months. The calls I made were never returned. The staff stopped answering my questions. Every time I mentioned my land, my house, I got silence. And that's when I started to realize this wasn't about care. This wasn't about safety. This was about erasing me. There's something about sitting in a room with no locks on the inside that changes the way you breathe. At first, I tried to keep track of time, mark the days on a napkin, count how many times they played the same soft piano music in the hallway. But the rhythm of places like Willow Hills is designed to unstick you from real life. Breakfast at 7. Pudding at 2. Blood pressure check at 4. Lights out at 9. No mail, no news, no visitors. The staff had a rotation of cheerful faces and distant eyes. They weren't cruel, but they weren't there to see me, just to keep me contained, upright, medicated, and quiet. After a while, I stopped asking questions. Not because I had no more to ask, but because I already knew the answers. The silence had weight. My son was not coming. No one was. And that form I'd signed, just a formality, had become a wall between me and everything I owned. Everything I was. I started to suspect more, and not just because of instinct. There were clues. Small, clumsy ones. One afternoon, I overheard a nurse whispering to another that my son had taken care of everything and that the papers had gone through. When she noticed me, she stopped talking. Another time, a young aide accidentally handed me the wrong medication tray, with someone else's name on it. I read the chart before she snatched it away. It said, Gerald McKinley, non-communicative, estate transferred, limited mobility. That wasn't my profile. That was a plan. Then came the visitor, a man in a suit. He didn't introduce himself, just said he was reviewing senior placements for compliance. But I could see the clipboard he held upside down, and it had a logo from a development firm I didn't recognize, Terra Nova Holdings, LLC, the kind that buys farmland for commercial use. He asked me casual questions. Did I remember my address? Could I recall the names of current politicians? He nodded when I answered clearly. But he didn't look reassured. He looked disappointed. That night, I sat by the window and stared out at the parking lot. Somewhere out there, Roger was spending the money he thought he had earned. Somewhere, he was telling people that his father was taken care of, that the land was available, and that the matter of ownership was settled. And for the first time in my life, I felt something colder than grief. I felt discarded, not mourned, not missed, just written off. I knew I had to get out, but I didn't have a plan. Until I met Tom. Room 204. A Marine, retired. 85 years old and still sharp enough to play chess and cheat at cards without getting caught. He'd been watching me since I arrived. Said I had the walk of a man who still gave a damn. I told him my story, not all at once, but in pieces. He listened, didn't interrupt, didn't pity, just nodded. And then one night, he said 5 words that changed everything. You want out? I'll help. Turns out, Tom had been working on an escape plan for months, just for the hell of it. Said it gave him something to do. He'd memorized the shift rotations, knew which back door wasn't alarmed, and even had a pair of old staff scrubs he'd stolen during laundry day. I didn't ask why he hadn't left. Maybe he just needed a reason. Maybe that reason was me. We waited for a rainy morning. That Thursday, while the nurses were distracted by a minor fall in the cafeteria, we slipped out the service exit behind the kitchen, walked a quarter-mile through wet grass to a chain-link fence. Tom boosted me over like I weighed nothing. I helped him climb after. We ended up on a side road, soaked to the bone, hearts pounding, but free. Tom had a friend, a mechanic in town, who owed him a favor. He dropped us off near the county records office. That's where the second blow landed. Roger had filed paperwork claiming full guardianship due to advanced cognitive decline. He'd cited delusions, erratic behavior, and inability to maintain personal hygiene. He claimed I had endangered myself by refusing medical care. And with those lies, he'd managed to legally transfer temporary ownership of my land into a family trust, one he controlled. But here's what he didn't count on. The paperwork wasn't complete. He'd missed a step, one signature, one medical affidavit. The transaction was pending, not final. And a public auction had been scheduled for the following week to legitimize the transfer by offering the land on the open market. Just a formality, of course, but a public one, one I could attend. That was the opening. That was the spark. I had 6 days. The morning after we found the auction notice, I woke up feeling like my bones had shifted, like something inside me had realigned, not with youth, but with purpose. For the first time in months, I had something bigger than anger. I had a reason, a deadline, a line drawn in the dirt. Tom stayed behind. Said he'd already broken enough rules for one lifetime. I understood. I hugged him tight, the way I used to hold Roger when he was little and scared after thunderstorms. There's a certain type of silence between men who know they've survived something together. He nodded once and said, "Take your story back." I called Jimmy, the only person I knew would answer. He was my neighbor back when Vivian was alive. A former electrician, twice divorced, drank too much but still believed in right and wrong. When I told him what happened, there was a pause. Then, "Where are you? I'm coming to get you." He picked me up from a gas station on Route 14, no questions asked. When I told him the whole story, Roger, the nursing home, the forged documents, the pending sale, he didn't flinch. He just looked ahead and said, "All right then, let's ruin his plans." Over the next few days, we worked like men on borrowed time. Jimmy drove me to the courthouse where I filed an emergency petition to halt the auction, citing mental competence and fraudulent guardianship claims. He introduced me to a legal aid attorney, a woman named Karen, sharp as a switchblade and twice as quick. She didn't sugarcoat anything. "This isn't going to be easy," she said. "He built a case on paperwork and silence. You'll need proof, and you'll need to show up." I told her I'd do both. We gathered medical records. 3 doctors from Willow Hills had evaluated me, and at least one had refused to sign off on the mental decline report. We got a notarized statement from Tom. We pulled surveillance footage showing me walking unaided, speaking clearly, feeding myself, even helping others. Karen built a file so thick it looked like a college dissertation. "We don't just need the truth," she said. "We need undeniable truth." Meanwhile, Roger kept moving. I found out he'd already given a developer verbal assurance about the land, contingent on auction results. There were whispers about rezoning, commercial plots, even a planned partnership with a chain store. He wasn't just trying to sell my property. He was using it to climb higher in the industry, one more step in his big, shiny dream. The morning of the auction, I shaved, put on the only suit I had left, the same one I wore to Vivian's funeral. Jimmy drove me to the courthouse. On the way, he said nothing, just tapped the steering wheel with 2 fingers like a heartbeat. When we pulled up, I saw the cars, rows of shiny sedans, men in blazers, people holding brochures with aerial shots of my land. There was coffee being served in paper cups. It looked like a wedding reception for vultures. I walked in and nobody looked twice. That was good. Let them think I was another old man who got lost on his way to the DMV. The auctioneer began his introduction, smiling, thanking everyone for attending. This prime tract in Westbrook County is ideal for mixed-use development. Family-owned, soon-to-be bank-released. A fantastic opportunity. I almost laughed. Soon-to-be bank-released. I wasn't dead. I wasn't even gone. When the bidding opened, the numbers came fast. $620,000, $635,000. And then, before the third bid, Jimmy stood up, calm, loud, clear. We object. The owner is present. He does not consent to this sale. Silence. Every head turned. Roger, standing near the front in a sleek jacket and polished shoes, looked like he'd been shot. When he saw me, his face didn't register surprise. It registered dread, like a man watching his elevator drop with the doors open. The auctioneer stammered. The clerk said there was a legal dispute pending. The judge, brought in to oversee the proceedings, asked for clarification. Karen stepped forward, handed over the file. The judge flipped through it, frowning deeper with every page. "Mr. McKinley," he finally said, "do you claim rightful ownership of this property?" I stood up, my knees creaking. "Yes, Your Honor. This land is mine. It was given to me by my father. I never gave consent to transfer it, and I am of sound mind to say that clearly, right here, right now." He asked me questions. I answered them all. Birth date, spouse's maiden name, how many acres in the West Field, the year the barn burned. I knew every detail. Then he turned to Roger. "Do you wish to contest your father's mental competence?" Roger opened his mouth, then closed it. The room waited. He finally said, "I thought I was doing what was best for him." "Did he ask you to?" No answer. "Then this auction is suspended pending full legal review." The room began to hum with whispers. People stood up, some annoyed, some curious, but it didn't matter. I had stopped it. With my voice, with my presence, with the truth. As I left the building, Roger followed me out. He didn't say anything at first, then, quietly, "You don't know what you've done." I turned to him. Looked at the man who used to hold my hand crossing the street, who used to fall asleep on my chest. "No," I said. "You don't know what you did." He flinched like he expected me to hit him, but I didn't raise my hand. I didn't need to. He was already bleeding, just not the kind anyone could see. The days after the auction felt like standing on cracked ice, calm on the surface, but you could hear it groaning underneath, threatening to give way at any second. Roger had been blindsided, yes, but he wasn't the type to walk away after one public setback. No, he was a grinder, a schemer. And if there was one thing I'd learned about him, it was that he'd rather burn the whole thing down than admit he lost. Karen filed a motion to freeze all property transfers and called for a court hearing to determine legal guardianship status. The judge agreed. A date was set. That gave us 3 weeks. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. Not yet. Jimmy let me stay in the spare room above his garage. No rent, no questions. Just a pot of coffee every morning and the occasional, "You okay?" I told him I was. I wasn't. I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the look in Roger's eyes. Panic, disbelief, something darker underneath. That look didn't say, "I'm sorry." It said, "You've ruined my plan." And I knew, deep down, that plan wasn't just about money. It was about removing me from the picture entirely. A few days later, a letter arrived. Not from Roger, from a private medical office with a neatly printed header and legal language. It stated that based on submitted video evidence and behavioral observations, I exhibited signs of progressive cognitive impairment and recommended immediate psychological reassessment and potential legal intervention. I stared at the signature. Some physician I'd never met. The implication was clear. Roger had submitted footage, probably from hidden cameras or nursing home check-ins, and spun it into a narrative. He was laying the groundwork to have me declared mentally unfit. When I showed it to Jimmy, he didn't speak. He picked up the phone and called the clinic. At first, they denied having a patient under my name. Then, when pressed, they admitted there had been an external assessment based on submitted third-party material. That's when we knew. Roger had tried to medicalize his betrayal. We pushed back. Hard. Karen filed a request for an independent panel evaluation. I went through every kind of test you can imagine. Memory recall, logic exercises, motor functions, blood work, even a brain scan. One doctor asked me to name all the U.S. presidents in order. I did, then gave him their years in office for good measure. After the evaluations, one of the neurologists said to me, "Mr. McKinley, your mental clarity is better than some folks half your age. If someone is trying to claim otherwise, they have an agenda." We submitted all the results to court, but I still wasn't satisfied. I wanted to see the land again. The place that started this war. I borrowed Jimmy's truck and drove out one morning down the old county road, past the gas station where I first kissed Vivian, past the church where we married, past the diner where Roger spilled a milkshake on my lap at age 9. When I pulled up to the property, my heart sank. There were flags stuck in the soil, bright orange and blue markers spaced evenly, like a battlefield survey. A trailer stood where my wife's rose garden used to be. The air smelled like diesel and raw dirt. A construction crew was milling around, measuring, drilling stakes. One man in a hard hat saw me and walked over. "Can I help you?" he asked. "This is my land," I said. He gave a short laugh. "You sure? We were told it's under redevelopment." "By who?" He shrugged. "Terra Nova Holdings? They said everything's been greenlit. We're just doing prep." I asked for documents. He said he was just the guy with the tape measure. I took pictures of everything, the flags, the trailer, the signs. Then I got back in the truck and sat there, hands gripping the wheel, until the sun dipped below the trees. Back in town, Jimmy contacted the planning office. Turns out Roger had signed a preliminary development agreement, contingent on final court clearance. It was legal, but barely. Just a soft opening to bulldoze the land under the radar. We filed for an injunction. The court granted it. All construction activities were suspended pending the hearing. But the message was clear. Roger wasn't backing down. Then came the next blow. Roger filed a formal petition requesting full conservatorship over me. He claimed I was living in unsafe conditions, neglecting personal hygiene, and making erratic accusations. He included a letter of support from my granddaughter, Katie. Katie, my sweet, freckled, wide-eyed Katie. The one who used to sit on my lap and read Emily Dickinson poems. The one who drew horses on the walls and said she wanted to be a vet. The last time I saw her, she was 17 and promising to visit more. Now, she was 19 and signing a document calling me mentally unstable. It shattered something in me. Not the facts, those were lies, and I knew it. But the image, the idea that somewhere, somehow Roger had convinced her I was broken, that I needed to be handled, boxed up, shelved. I didn't cry. I don't do that much anymore. But something inside me went quiet. Not defeated, focused. Jimmy looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "There's no way back now." He was right. This wasn't about land anymore. It was about being erased. The conservatorship hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. That gave us 6 days to prepare. 6 days to prove I was still a man in full possession of his mind, his will, and his rights. 6 days to fight back against the lie that I was some confused relic clinging to old memories. But the deeper we dug, the more we uncovered. And what we found turned my stomach. Roger had not only filed for legal control over my estate, he had retroactively submitted medical evaluations written by a paid consultant, not a licensed physician. The man had once worked for a chain of senior facilities and had been reprimanded twice for ethical violations. That was the source of the earlier recommendation that I be psychologically reassessed. It wasn't neutral, it was bought. And that letter Katie signed? It had been rewritten 3 times. We managed to get a leaked draft from someone in Roger's office. An earlier version said I was independent but eccentric. The final version called me paranoid, unstable, and emotionally manipulative. It even included a line stating I exhibited early signs of dementia, including visual hallucinations. That line cut deeper than I expected, because once, years ago, I had told Katie that I still saw her grandmother sometimes, in dreams, in the wind through the kitchen curtains, in the smell of baking bread. I told her that not to frighten her, but to let her know that love lingers, that grief is a shape we carry. Now that memory had been turned into ammunition, I didn't recognize the girl who signed that paper, but I knew who had handed it to her. Roger had built a fortress around his lie. Walls of paperwork, foundations of forged compassion. He hadn't just tried to take my land. He'd tried to overwrite my legacy, to say that I was gone before I was gone. That way, when the world saw my name on a deed transfer, it wouldn't blink. It would say, well, he was slipping anyway. Karen called it a textbook erasure play. He's counting on you not showing up, not being clear enough to fight back. But we've got the tests, the footage, and your testimony. And more importantly, you're going to be in that room. I nodded. But something in me was unraveling. I kept thinking about Vivian, about what she'd say if she saw all this, about the way her voice used to catch when she talked about family. Blood doesn't make you safe, she once told me. It just makes the cuts deeper. I never understood it. Now I did. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed in layers. The courthouse was always too cold. Jimmy drove me again, same as before, but this time he didn't say anything. He just handed me a folded piece of paper. I opened it. One sentence, in his thick, blocky handwriting, "You're not a ghost." I held onto that note like it was armor. Inside the courtroom, the air felt sharp, the kind of cold that gets into your teeth. Roger sat at the petitioner's table, flanked by 2 attorneys. Katie sat behind him, arms crossed, her jaw clenched. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I was told I'd get a chance to speak, but first came the affidavits, the paperwork, the concerns Roger had listed. They painted a picture of a man who was confused, aggressive, unstable, a danger to himself. It was like reading my own obituary, written by a stranger who hated me. Then Karen stood and began to dismantle it, one document at a time. She pointed out inconsistencies, highlighted contradictions, cited the evaluation results, the lack of medical backing, the altered drafts. She brought up the footage of me mowing my own lawn, helping another resident find his medication, holding a chess tournament at Willow Hills. She played a clip of me talking with a therapist, calmly recounting my history, even laughing at one point. Then I was called up. The judge asked me if I understood why we were here. I said yes. He asked me what I wanted. I said, to be left alone, to die with my name intact, to live the way I've always lived, by choice, not by permission. Then he asked what I thought had happened. So I told him. I told him about the morning they came to take me, about the woman in scrubs and the men with soft voices and firm hands, about the locked doors, the pills, the silence, about the auction, the forged forms, the way my own son had looked at me like I was in his way. And then I looked over at Roger. Really looked. He wasn't sweating. He wasn't ashamed. He was blank, polished, like a man giving a presentation to investors. No remorse, just calculation. He was already thinking of his next move. That's when I changed my tone. I said, "This isn't just about land, it's about legacy. My father plowed that soil with his bare hands. I buried my wife under an oak tree we planted together. My son wants to turn it into a parking lot with his name on the paperwork and my ghost in the dirt. And he's using the system to do it. I'm not confused. I'm not unstable. I'm angry. And I'm still here." The judge was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I will review all documentation and render a decision by end of week. In the meantime, no actions may be taken regarding Mr. McKinley's property or person." That night, I walked outside and sat on Jimmy's porch. I watched the wind push through the trees like something alive. The stars were sharp, cold, honest. Katie sent me a message the next morning. One line. "I didn't know it was this bad. I'm sorry." I didn't reply, because some things can't be answered in words. They have to be shown. The judge's ruling came on a Thursday morning. The courthouse clerk called Karen at 9:17 a.m. and read the decision aloud over the phone. I sat at her office desk, gripping the edge like I was waiting for a jury to deliver a sentence. But there was no sentence. There was freedom. The court finds no sufficient evidence to grant conservatorship over Mr. Gerald McKinley, the statement began. All claims of cognitive decline are unsupported by clinical or legal standard. The respondent remains fully autonomous in managing his estate and personal affairs. No stammer, no asterisk, just finality. Karen looked at me with a mix of victory and caution. "This doesn't mean he won't try something else," she said. "But for now, you're clear." I didn't speak. I couldn't. Jimmy drove us back home in silence. I rolled down the window and let the air hit my face like rain after drought. I didn't smile. Not yet. Because I knew this wasn't just about winning a case. It was about reclaiming my name, piece by piece, from a man I once held as a baby. But the story wasn't over. 2 days later, I walked into the county land office. I brought every document I had, deeds, titles, family records, my father's notarized gift letter from 1967, even the map I'd drawn by hand decades ago, showing the boundaries and the creek line. I told the clerk I wanted to place the property in a trust, not under my son's name, not under mine, but in a community preservation fund. The land would remain untouched, undeveloped, a conservation area, open to the public, with a plaque honoring my wife, my parents, and the families that once worked that soil. The clerk looked surprised. "You sure?" he asked. "That's prime land." I said, "Not to me, it's not." He handed me the paperwork. I signed it. By Monday morning, the deal was official. The land was no longer mine. Not in the ownership sense. But it would always be mine. In the way that matters. Untouchable. Unbulldozable. That afternoon, Roger called. First time in months. I didn't answer. He left a message. Calm. Controlled. He said he was sorry it had come to this. That he was just trying to protect me. That the process got ahead of the intention. Corporate speak for betrayal. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't even ask to meet. He just ended with, "I hope we can find a way back." I deleted the message. I didn't need a way back. Later that week, a journalist from a local paper reached out. She'd been tipped off about the hearing, the auction, the revoked guardianship. She wanted to run a story: elder betrayal and the fight for land. I declined the interview because this wasn't a story for headlines. This was a scar, and you don't put scars on display. You live with them. Quietly. I went back to the property one last time. Walked the full length of it, from the gravel path near the main road down to the broken fence post by the creek. I stopped at the oak tree where Vivian's ashes were buried. I knelt, not to pray, but to listen. The wind rustled. The ground was firm beneath me, steady, like it remembered everything I had fought for. That night I slept a full 8 hours for the first time in years, not because I was safe, but because I was whole again. After the ruling and the trust paperwork, everything seemed to slow down. Not in a sad way, just quieter. Like the land itself was finally breathing again, no longer waiting for bulldozers or lies. I moved into the small cabin near the west edge of the property. It used to be a tool shed, but Jimmy and I cleaned it out, added insulation, fixed the roof. It had everything I needed: one bed, one table, a window that caught the morning light, and silence that didn't accuse me of anything. I planted tomatoes behind the cabin, put up a small fence to keep the deer out. Some days I'd sit outside, just watching the wind shift through the grass, listening to the ground like it might speak back. I didn't expect forgiveness from Roger, from Katie, from the years I lost. I wasn't waiting for it anymore. People in town started hearing about what happened. I became a kind of legend among the older folks. They'd stop me at the feed store or wave from their porches, nodding like I'd done something brave. I didn't feel brave. I felt used up, not empty, just scraped clean, like a field after harvest. What remained was soil, and soil is where new things can grow. I got a letter from Katie, not a text, not an email, a real letter, written in blue ink. She said she didn't know what she was signing when Roger gave her the form, said she trusted him, said she never imagined he'd lie to her about me. She said she missed the way I used to tell stories about the stars and the coyotes, and the way her grandma laughed with her whole body. She said she was sorry. I folded the letter and put it in a tin box under my bed. I didn't write back. Not yet. Maybe not ever, but I kept it. Because some things, even if they can't be fixed, still deserve to be remembered. Roger left the state. Word was he'd lost clients after the court documents became public. He wasn't disbarred, no laws were technically broken, but his name got tied to involuntary elder management, and the deals dried up. He sold his firm, moved to Arizona. The last I heard, he was working on some new venture. I don't care what it is. Sometimes people ask if I ever think about revenge, if I ever wanted to take him down further. I tell them this: he took his shot, he lost, and now he has to live with the truth, the way I had to live with the betrayal. That's more punishment than anything I could invent. I kept my land. I kept my name. I didn't let them write me out of my own life. And that, at the end of everything, is enough. It was early April when the letter came, handwritten on lined paper with the school district's name printed faintly in the corner. And I remember the way the envelope sat on my little cabin table, like it was waiting for me to be ready, not demanding. Attention just existing gently, like something honest tends to do. It was from a teacher at the elementary school in Westbrook, someone named Miss Callahan, who said she'd heard about the trust I had set up for the land and wanted to know if her 5th grade class could come out to visit for an afternoon. She wrote about teaching environmental science, about kids who didn't know where vegetables came from beyond plastic bags, about how they were learning to name trees and measure soil temperature and identify bugs not with fear but curiosity. And she asked if maybe the class could walk the fields and see what unpaved land looked like, if they could touch bark that hadn't been lacquered into playground mulch, or sit in the grass without it being AstroTurf. I sat with the letter a long time before answering, not because I needed to think, but because the idea of that kind of visit, children running across a field that had been nearly stolen from memory itself, felt so unexpected it made something in my chest tighten and release all at once, like a knot finally unwinding. I wrote back by hand, told her I'd be honored to have them come, told her there were some spots near the south fence where the ground got too soft after rain and they'd need boots, told her I'd cut back the thorn brush along the creek path, told her there was still an old windmill that didn't spin but looked nice in the morning light. The morning they arrived, I was already up by 5, not because I had to be, but because the air felt charged in a way I hadn't felt since I was a younger man, like the soil itself was expectant, and I moved slow but steady, making sure the path down to the creek wasn't too muddy, making sure the old barn doors didn't creak too loud, brushing off the bench by the apple tree even though I knew none of those kids would sit there long enough to matter. At exactly 10:04 a.m., I heard it. The low, unmistakable wheeze of a yellow school bus making its way down my long gravel road, and I stood at the edge of the porch, one hand on the rail, the other holding my coffee, watching the dust trail behind it. Like a memory being chased. When the bus stopped, the door opened with a hiss, and they came spilling out. Not just a few, but dozens of them. Backpacks swinging, sneakers hitting dirt, voices rising like birds after a storm. And I was struck by how full of life they were. How even the quiet ones had a kind of motion to them. Eyes darting, hands twitching, like their very cells refused stillness. Miss Callahan was the last off, a small woman in a denim jacket and hiking boots, with a clipboard in one hand and a kind smile that wasn't afraid of wrinkles. She shook my hand like someone who respected landowners, not just saw them as relics, and thanked me again for having them out. We started at the edge of the main field, where the switchgrass grows in uneven clumps, and the soil is dark and loose from decades of care. And I talked about the way my father taught me to test its readiness by squeezing a handful and watching how it broke apart, not too wet, not too dry, just right to cradle a seed. I didn't lecture. This wasn't school. This was remembering. And the kids didn't fidget or yawn. They asked questions, some silly, some smart, some that made me pause before answering, like the girl who asked if the trees missed me when I was gone. And I told her, maybe, but they're patient. And she nodded like she understood something adults would probably laugh at. We walked along the western fence line where the cottonwoods lean like old men listening to gossip. And I told them about the time a storm split one right down the middle and how it kept growing anyway, twisted but alive, and one boy asked if I'd ever split like that, and I said nothing for a moment, just looked at the tree and said, "Not yet." By noon we were down by the creek bed where the water runs shallow and clear, and they were crouching to find salamanders and skipping stones and drawing with sticks in the mud, and Miss Callahan told them to be gentle, that this wasn't a playground but something older and quieter. And they nodded, surprisingly respectful for a generation raised on screens. I sat on a rock under the sycamore tree and watched them, not with distance but with awe, because what I saw wasn't noise, or mess, or risk. It was life reclaiming a space that had nearly been sold for concrete and silence. One boy found a rusted horseshoe near the old tool shed and asked if it was treasure. I told him it was, but not the kind you spend. He said, "Then what do you do with it?" I said, "You remember it." He tucked it in his pocket like it was made of gold. After lunch, they drew pictures of the land, trees, fences, clouds, even the old pump I'd tried to fix 3 times before giving up. One girl drew a picture of me, sitting under the oak tree, with the sun behind me and the barn in the background, and when she handed it to me, she said, "I hope it stays like this forever." I didn't correct her. I didn't explain how things don't stay, how barns fall and names get erased and land becomes money in the mouths of men who never touched it. I just said, "Me too," and folded the paper like it was scripture. By the time the bus pulled away, the sky had gone a shade softer, the air a little cooler, and the fields were quiet again, but not empty. I stood there a long time after they left, holding that picture in one hand and the rusted horseshoe in the other, thinking about what it meant to keep something, not just physically, but spiritually, to protect a memory from being stolen or paved. Over. The kids wouldn't remember every detail. They'd forget the names of trees, the feel of dirt under their nails. But maybe, years from now, one of them would stand in a parking lot and feel wrong without knowing why. Maybe they'd see a wildflower crack through cement and feel joy instead of annoyance. Maybe they'd tell their own children that once they walked a field that was saved by a stubborn old man who refused to be erased. And maybe that's all I ever really wanted. I started writing the letter not because I believed it would change anything, or because I thought there was anything left between us worth rescuing, but because the words were building inside me like a pressure I couldn't keep carrying, and I needed to put them somewhere that wasn't just the inside of my ribs. It wasn't meant to be a plea or a rebuke or even a reckoning. It was just a release, a way of speaking into the quiet after so many months of being spoken about, spoken for, or silenced entirely. I found a yellow legal pad in the drawer, the kind Vivian used to keep by the phone to write grocery lists or leave notes about the laundry, and I sat at the old table by the window, the one that looks out toward the east field where the sun breaks. First in the morning, and where the frost clings to the fence wire a little longer than anywhere else, I uncapped a pen that hadn't been used in years and wrote his name at the top. Not Son or Roger or you, but the full name I gave him the day he was born, Roger James McKinley. And somehow just writing it out made my hand tremble a little. Not from age, but from the weight of the history behind it. I told him that I remembered the day he was born, not because it was dramatic or sacred or full of light like people describe in movies, but because it was small and quiet and ordinary in the best way. Vivian holding him like something both fragile and indestructible, her voice hoarse but laughing. Me too scared to touch him at first, and then too proud to let go once I did. I wrote that I remembered how he used to ride in the back of the truck bed, standing up like a superhero when he thought I wasn't watching, or how he'd run barefoot through the hay rows chasing dragonflies, or how he cried the first time he had to. Kill a snake because he thought even bad things deserved a place in the world. I told him I remembered the smell of his hair after summer swims, the way he used to ask me if trees could feel pain, the way he once gave Vivian a rock shaped like a heart and told her it was better than candy because it would last forever. I wrote all that not to make him feel guilty or to shame him into remembering who he was, but to remind myself that the person I raised wasn't always the man who stood across from me in court with polished shoes and polished lies. Then I told him what he did. I told him what it felt like to sign a piece of paper under the eyes of my own son, and later learn it was the beginning of my erasure, that the ink I laid down in good faith became the ink he used to take my name off the things I built. I told him what it felt like to be told by strangers that I was no longer in charge of my own life, that my house, my land, my records, even my memory had been reassigned. I told him what it felt like to be locked away in a place where no one called me by name unless it was followed by a dosage or a schedule, where I became a patient file instead of a man. I told him what it felt like to be invisible in a world I helped make, to be talked over and managed and cataloged. I wrote that he didn't just take a title deed, he took the story that connected me to the dirt under my feet, to the woman I buried with my own hands under that oak tree, to the father who handed me the land without condition. I said it plainly. You took something you didn't earn and lost something you'll never get back. Then I tried to explain what that loss was. I told him that when you betray blood, it doesn't just cut, it untethers. It makes the whole tree wobble, makes every past kindness into a question mark. I told him that even now, after everything, I don't hate him, because hate requires a kind of closeness I no longer feel. What I feel is absence, a cold space where a sun used to be, and it's not dramatic or loud. It's just air where warmth used to sit. I told him that legacy isn't land or money or even name. It's memory held by the people who loved you, and he'd thrown that into the fire for a shot at some imaginary ladder, and even if he climbed it, there'd be nothing waiting at the top but silence. I told him that no matter what he builds now, it won't erase what he tried to destroy. Then I wrote something I didn't expect. I pity you. I do. Because even now, even with the papers voided and the court saying my name still means something, I don't think he understands what he did. I think he still sees it as a financial setback, a failed plan, a business deal that went sideways. I don't think he realizes that he broke something sacred, and I don't think he ever will. I stopped there, not with a flourish, just with a period. I looked at the page, 12 full sheets, front and back, written in block letters that sagged slightly from the weight of the ink and the years in my hand. I read it once, slowly. Then I folded each page, stacked them carefully, placed them in an envelope I didn't seal. I held it for a long time, walked it out to the wood stove, lit a match, watched it burn. Not because I didn't mean every word, but because some words aren't meant to be received. They're meant to be spoken to the past, like prayers over an unmarked grave. After the fire died down, I sat in the quiet and stared at the ash until it looked like dust blown in from some other life. And I realized I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I wasn't anything loud or sharp. I was done. And sometimes being done is the only peace you get. And sometimes it's enough. I spent the following hours reflecting not only on the betrayal itself, but also on what it meant for the future of my relationship with my daughter. It wasn't just the act of financial deception that stung. It was the realization that somewhere along the road, the values I had worked so hard to instill in her had been disregarded. I wondered what kind of internal justification she must have constructed to allow herself to rationalize stealing from her own father. Perhaps she had convinced herself it was harmless, that I had enough money, that I wouldn't notice, or worse, that I would forgive her as I had countless times before. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe my forgiveness had become an enabler, blurring the lines between love and accountability. I knew that this time, things had to change. After taking the necessary steps with the bank and ensuring that my financial information was secure, I began to consider how best to confront her. I didn't want to cause a dramatic scene filled with shouting and accusations. That would only harden her defensiveness. Instead, I planned a calm but firm conversation, one that would force her to see not only the wrong in her actions, but also the impact they had on trust, dignity, and the essence of familial bonds. I waited until that evening. I heard laughter from the living room. They were watching television together, unaware that their scheme had already begun to crumble. I sat in the kitchen, preparing some tea, and invited them both to join me when they had a moment. They entered casually, as if nothing had happened, her husband holding his phone, and she with that familiar, slightly guarded smile that, for years, I had mistaken for innocence. I started without preamble. "The cruise you tried to book earlier," I said slowly, watching their reactions, "was declined." Her face froze, and she turned sharply to her husband, who looked equally confused and alarmed. "I know what you did," I continued. "I know you used my credit card details. while I was asleep. The room went quiet, save for the ticking of the old wall clock behind me. My daughter opened her mouth to speak, but faltered. Her husband looked at her, then at me, and then back again, as if weighing the costs of denial. "You could have asked," I added. And I might have said yes or no, but at least it would have been honest. My daughter's expression collapsed into a mixture of guilt and embarrassment. "We didn't think it would be a big deal," she mumbled. "You've always helped us before. We just wanted something for ourselves." Those words struck me with surprising clarity. Something for ourselves. As if everything I had already given, my time, my money, my presence, had somehow not been enough. As if parenthood meant an infinite well of sacrifice, one that demanded no gratitude in return. I took a deep breath and explained as calmly as I could that while I loved her, I would not be made into a victim in my own home. I had already taken steps to protect myself, I said. The bank was notified, fraud reports were filed, and new security measures were in place. If it happens again, I warned, there will be legal consequences. Not because I want to punish you, but because I have to protect myself. They were stunned. Maybe they hadn't thought I would take it so seriously. Maybe they assumed my love would continue to make me blind. But I wasn't blind anymore. The next few days were awkward and tense. They stayed mostly in their room, speaking in hushed tones behind closed doors. I went about my routines, reading, walking, managing the house, but I could feel the atmosphere had changed. I could see in her eyes that she was ashamed, but also uncertain of how to mend the damage. I didn't offer easy forgiveness. That, I believed, had to be earned. On the third morning, she approached me quietly in the kitchen. "Dad," she said, "I'm sorry. I really am. I don't know what we were thinking." I looked up from my newspaper. "You weren't thinking," I said. "You were taking." She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "I've started looking for extra work," she said. "I want to pay you back. I don't know how long it'll take, but I want to try." I studied her face, and for the first time in a long while, I believed her. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the tone, the posture, the quiet sincerity that couldn't be faked. Still, something in me had shifted permanently. I realized that boundaries had to be drawn, and more importantly, maintained. I sat down with both of them and outlined new expectations if they were to continue living under my roof. They would contribute to groceries and utilities. They would treat my property and my privacy with respect. Any violation of these conditions would mean they'd have to find their own place. It wasn't punishment, it was structure, long overdue. To my surprise, they agreed without protest. Maybe they had needed this boundary all along. Maybe I had needed to draw it more clearly years ago. As weeks turned into months, something remarkable began to happen. The atmosphere in the house lightened. They both found part-time jobs. My daughter began helping more around the house, cooking meals, even joining me on my morning walks. We started talking again, not just small talk, but real conversations. About life, about mistakes, about hopes and regrets. I shared stories from my past she had never heard before. About her late mother. About the early struggles of building a life. About the sacrifices made not out of obligation, but out of love. And she listened. Really listened. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we were rebuilding something. Not the same structure we once had, but something stronger, because it was honest. Eventually, she repaid the money. Not all at once, of course, but gradually. Every payment, no matter how small, was accompanied by a handwritten note. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for still being here. I'm trying." I kept every note. not out of sentimentality, but because they were symbols of a choice she was making every day to do better, to be better. Her husband, too, changed. I saw in him a sense of responsibility that had previously been lacking. He took on extra shifts, helped with yard work, and even began calling me sir again. Not in a formal way, but in a tone that conveyed respect. It didn't undo what had happened, but it marked a shift, a step forward. In the end, the attempted theft became an unexpected turning point. It forced a reckoning that had been years in the making. It peeled away the comfortable lies and made space for truth, however painful. And in that truth, we found the beginnings of healing. I won't say everything is perfect. Trust, once broken, is slow to rebuild. There are moments when doubt creeps in, when I check my wallet a second time or hesitate before sharing financial details. But I no longer live in quiet disappointment or unspoken resentment. We speak now. We set expectations. We own our mistakes. And perhaps most importantly, we forgive, not as an escape from consequences, but as a path forward, chosen deliberately, one day at a time.